What are we discussing on today's Locked on Dimebacks podcast? Which D-backs free agents are starting to pick up their options, and which tier one free agents on the open market should the D-backs target this offseason?
You are Locked on Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked on Dimebacks podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. You're listening to who? The always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas, multimedia journalist and graphic designer. So please go check out my website, millerthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. If you want to see more content by me, please follow me on Twitter at CareerThomas24 for my personal account, or look up Locked on Dimebacks, both Twitter and Instagram, for the podcast handle. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, we're going to be discussing D-backs free agents who are starting to make decisions on their options, tier one free agents on the open market that the D-backs should consider targeting, and then the Jordan Montgomery player review to wrap up the podcast. Thank you for making Locked on Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I would not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, and viewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free. It's available on all platforms, so please continue to tell your friends. And one of those platforms is YouTube. Please hit subscribe to Locked on Diamondbacks on YouTube. All right. Let's get back into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, and let's discuss D-backs options, the D-backs free agents who are starting to make decisions on some of the options that they've had, because so far it looks like we got two D-backs players who have made decisions on whether or not they want to return to the team next season. The first guy that we saw make a decision, Randal Grichuk of the D-backs. He played DH, he played a little outfield, and to be honest, this one was not a surprise. We have predicted Grichuk to turn down his option all offseason, because a $6 million player option or a mutual option for Grichuk after the season he just had, it didn't feel like he was going to return to the D-backs. Sadly, he had one of the best seasons, if not the best season of his career. And yes, it was only 106 games, so the sample size wasn't as large as it could have been. But in terms of like a slash line, like a 291 average was a career high for Randal Grichuk at 875 OPS, second highest of his career, and the highest since 2015. Like, this was truly one of the best seasons Randal Grichuk has ever had. Defensively, he was solid. Clutch hitting, one of the best D-backs players this past season. When you look at runners in scoring position, high leverage moments, Randal Grichuk came through repeatedly. You look at pinch hitting. This was the best pinch hitter in Major League Baseball, coming off the bench, delivering big clutch knocks for the D-backs. Randal Grichuk was so important to the D-backs this year, coming through in late game situations. I really enjoyed Grichuk, and to be honest, he blew away my expectations. Entering the year after we acquired him in the offseason, I was just like, okay, considering he's your second DH, I thought the move was really nice, cherry on top of the offseason, but I honestly didn't have major expectations for Grichuk. I always thought he was just kind of like a fine player. I thought he was always kind of benefited and boosted from playing in like Colorado for a little bit. And then when he was with like the Blue Jays, I was like, he's fine. He's solid. I probably viewed him like how you view like a Lourdes Gurriel, but maybe like a little bit lesser. I probably had him like 90% of how I viewed like Lourdes Gurriel, most likely. And you could probably make the argument that Randal Grichuk was better than Lourdes Gurriel when he was in Toronto. But regardless, I was like, he's a solid player, but I'm not going to be too excited with Randy in the building. And I was flat out wrong. This guy was a rock star this season. The way he played, his consistent at bats, like offensively, he was consistent all year long. When you look at the numbers, he never slowed down or anything from game one to game 162. And I think for the D-backs, he's definitely going to get more money, and he's probably going to want a better role, more playing time. I mean, only 106 games and was losing playing time to guys like Pavin Smith in the outfield. Like, if I'm Randal Grichuk after the season I just had, I should be demanding more money and I should be demanding a better role. And so, as much as I want to see him back in the D-backs uniform next year, I just think it's going to be tough. I don't think the D-backs are going to be cheap when it comes to signing free agents. That doesn't mean they're going to go out there and get Corbin Burns or Garrett Cole, but I think a guy like Randal Grichuk, D-backs might just say, you know what? He might be too expensive. We don't need two DHs again. Let's go get one very good DH and let's see what can happen. Maybe the D-backs still bring back Randal Grichuk. It's still a possibility. I mean, I don't think his price tag is going to be crazy. He's just going to want more money than he just had. Like, if he wanted $10 million to $12 million a year for 2 years, I don't think that's crazy at all for a Randal Grichuk. So, curious to see if the D-backs try to bring him back this offseason, because they definitely should. After the season he just had in Arizona, would definitely welcome back Randy in 2025. Then the other D-backs player who made a decision on their option today is Jordan Montgomery, who we'll discuss in segment number 3 when we do his player review. But Monty definitely had a down season. It felt like Ken Kendrick was kind of bashing Monty after the season to hopefully nudge him in the direction of declining his player option, which was for like $22 million. But of course, when you're Monty and you have a massive Bumgarner level season, and all you have to do is say yes to the contract and you get $20+ million in your bank account, easy to see why Monty decided to pick up his option. And now the real work begins for Monty, the path and the road to redemption in Arizona, because it's not just Ken Kendrick's comments and obviously no one in the front office is happy, but like, you got to win back the fan base of the D-backs. Like, Monty goes out there and from game 1, he starts looking bad. Start 1, the first month of the season, he comes out poorly. Like, D-backs fans are going to be upset. D-backs fans are going to be frustrated. They're going to, more than likely, going to be booing Jordan Montgomery when he's out there on the mound, having those blow-up starts. And so for Monty, got to get in the lab this off season, get on a little workout program, start eating some vegetables, come back next season better in shape, because we've seen this guy be way more leaner in his career, have a little bit more velocity, be a really highly effective frontline starter in Major League Baseball, good enough to the point where he could be the best starter, arguably, in a rotation that wins a World Series. And as a D-backs fan, we saw it up close and personal. And so for the D-backs, Jordan Montgomery, get in the lab this offseason and come back next season healthy, because there's still a path to Jordan Montgomery being successful in Arizona. He's still more than likely going to get the number 5 spot in the rotation next year. I don't think what we saw from Monty this year, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's like Monty for the rest of his career. Madison Bumgarner, I think it was a different situation. I think he was cooked. Monty, I don't think is cooked. I think it was a really bad year where he was out of shape, so many bad factors. So I'm hoping and praying for the Jordan Montgomery bounce back in 2025. And now I want to talk about some tier 1 free agents that I think the D-backs should be considering this offseason, and we'll discuss in segment number 2. And if you want to buy tickets to an upcoming D-backs game or a sporting event, I mean, obviously you have to wait a while for D-backs, but maybe it's a Cardinals game you want to go to. If you're trying to buy tickets to any kind of event, you're going to want to go to GameTime, because GameTime is the best place for last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy theater, and more. GameTime has flash deals which save you even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. They have zone deals which save you even more when you choose a section and you let GameTime choose the seats. They even have this feature called all-in pricing. When you toggle that feature on, it shows you the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and more with GameTime Picks. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account or redeem code LOCKDOWNMLB for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right. Let's get back into the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast, and let's discuss some tier 1 free agents. I'll say tier 1 in quotations, because the real tier one of free agency. I don't think the D-backs are tapping into that market. This is tier one, affordable, realistic guys for the D-backs. This is not Juan Soto or Corbin Burns. Unfortunately, I think those guys are just out the price range, right? Garrett Cole becomes a free agent. I think he's out the price range. And then there's also, I guess, some guys that would be considered tier one dudes who I just don't think really fits with the D-backs. Like Alex Bregman, like I'd rather have Eugenio Suarez at his number than Alex Bregman. Willie Adames, I think Willie Adames is really good, but I'm fine just paying Geraldo Perdomo all-star arbitration salary. And so these are the guys who are tier one, or at least close to tier one. These I think are the best of the dudes that the D-backs can afford in the D-backs price range. These would be their tier one targets. And for me, I think the first guy is a guy who you might think could be like on the class above this class, maybe closer to the Juan Soto, Corbin Burns. But I think Blake Snell could be a guy that the D-backs could go out there and potentially afford, because I think Blake Snell could be one of those short-term overpay guys. Got the same kind of deal that Jordan Montgomery got at the start of the season this past year, but the difference is Blake Snell performed really well with the Padres. They both kind of started off slow, but Blake Snell for the Giants, ended up finishing the season really hot. And like I mentioned on the podcast, I think yesterday, Blake Snell, the all-time career leader in strikeouts per 9 innings. This guy, by the numbers, statistically, a really, really good pitcher. Yes, he's had some up and down moments throughout his career, some really weird splits when you look at some of his career numbers, but a Cy Young Award winner in 2023. Look at the last 3 years. Honestly, you look at the last 5 years, or you basically look at all the years going back to 2020 is what I'm trying to say. Take out 2021. It's 4 straight years of dominance for Blake Snell. Strikeout numbers are elite. Doesn't give up a ton of hits at all. Doesn't give up home runs. The biggest issue with him is the walk rate. He gives up a ton of walks, but he strikes out a ton and he doesn't give up a lot of hits. And so it's a little give and take with Blake Snell. He might give up the most walks in baseball, but if he's not giving up home runs, he's not giving up hard contact, he's not giving up hits, he's striking out at a better rate than anyone else in Major League history. I think Blake Snell's a pretty good guy. We've seen him pitch on a pretty big stage, go to the World Series before. He's only been to the playoffs 3 times. He hasn't been there since 2022 with the Padres, where he did have a little bit of an up and down postseason. But for the most part, I think Blake Snell is a really good pitcher who is going to be expensive, but I think it's short-term expensive, not long-term expensive with Blake Snell. I think he's going to be a guy that maybe gets like a 3-year, $90 million contract this offseason. And considering the D-backs gave Monty $20 million, Erod $20 million, maybe they could get rid of one of those contracts and renegotiate and retool their money to go and pay Blake Snell. Another guy who I think could be kind of interesting is a guy that we're seeing currently, or I guess we did see currently in the postseason, even on the World Series stage. Jack Flaherty, who ended up having a very good season. He had a 3.17 ERA on the year, 3.58 ERA with the Dodgers post-trade deadline, but did not have himself the best postseason as we saw his velocity decline. And for Flaherty, this is more of getting that number 4 starter for the D-backs. If you don't trust Erod, if you don't trust Monty, if you want to maybe use Ryan Nelson as your number 4 starter, or just have him as that number 5 starter, long reliever once you get to the postseason, then maybe you want to add Flaherty as just your number 4 starter, where you say, hey, in a postseason series, you hope and pray he could be the guy that delivers you the win, gives you a great chance, a great opportunity, sets you up in the ball game to potentially win game number 4. But if he doesn't, you go back to the top of the rotation with your studs. But at least you would feel good about him as your number 4 starter, and you might feel better about him than your current options in Erod or Jordan Montgomery if neither one of those 2 guys bounces back. Now, Flaherty, do I truly believe the season he just had is that sustainable? I don't know. He was bad in 23. He was bad in 2022. He was bad in 2020. He's been good 2 of the last 5 seasons. He is a guy that has nice strikeout numbers and a good whip, but his velocity fluctuates at times. And I don't know if I trust Jack Flaherty and his long-term potential. I do think he had a very nice season this past year, but I think there's a reason why we started to see him start to falter down the stretch and why I felt like he started to hit a wall down the stretch. I don't believe in Jack Flaherty as a long-term pitcher. I don't think he could pitch game 1 to the final game of a postseason. So I think Jack Flaherty would be interesting for the D-backs as the number 4 starter, but only as the number 4 starter. Next up, Walker Buehler is another interesting guy who I think could really, I think this is a more intriguing option than a Jack Flaherty. Buehler by the numbers this past season, not the best, right? A 5.38 ERA. The hits per 9 was bad. The strikeouts per 9 is not where it used to be. Still dealing with some command issues, but I think we saw as the season wore on for Buehler, as he started to get a little bit more confidence, start to build up that arm strength, he started to put it together a little bit toward the end of the season. He did close out the World Series as well. And if you look at the postseason numbers, the last 10 innings pitch he had in this past postseason, no earned runs. If Walker Buehler can get back to the guy that we saw pre-Tommy John, that is one of the best pitchers in Major League Baseball. And maybe he can't get back to it. But I like the fact that he would be a couple years removed from Tommy John, would have already had a 2024 season where he got the rust and the struggles out of his system, where you can go into next year, a full year, take, the load management away, take the handcuffs and the training wheels off of Walker Buehler and just treat him like a normal pitcher. Buehler, high risk, high reward, but he has the potential. The D-backs signed him this offseason. He has the potential to have maybe the highest upside of any starter. There are some other starters I want to talk about on a podcast tomorrow that the D-backs could consider that is also high risk, high reward. But Walker Buehler is someone that I would be very interested in the D-backs bringing in at the right price. And now I want to talk about Jordan Montgomery and the 2024 season he just had, considering he's coming back to the D-backs in 2025. And hey, if you want to bet on the D-backs over under total for 2025, then the best place to do that, of course, is going to be FanDuel, because get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Visit FanDuel.com today to join. My favorite thing to do on FanDuel is the same game parlay. Give me the Saints money line. Give me Kamara over on touchdowns. Give me Kamara over on receptions. When that 3-leg hits, it never does. But when it does, it brings a big smile to my face. And if you want a big smile on your face, go to FanDuel. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right. Let's get back to the Locked on Diamondbacks podcast. Let's do a little Jordan Montgomery player review, as we're doing every day this offseason, picking a player and talking about their strengths and weaknesses from 2024 and setting up goals for 2025 if they do come back to the D-backs in 2025. And the guy we're talking about today, Jordan Montgomery, is coming back to the D-backs next season after picking up his option. I'm sure there were some disgruntled D-backs fans when they saw the news of Monty picking up his option. I got to be honest, it wasn't like I was ecstatic when I saw it, which is crazy because think about where we were the beginning of the regular season last year, right? The day before the regular season, you see Jordan Montgomery signs with the D-backs. You're like, Monty's going to be what? Our, I guess, number 4 starter, because at the time we knew Erod was going to miss the start of the season. I guess Monty had to miss the start of the season too, but we were like, Monty's going to be our number 4, maybe number 5 starter. Like, who's going to get the bump when we get to the playoffs? Like, is it going to be Fott? Is it going to be Monty? Is it going to be Erod? Like, do the D-backs now have the best 1 through 5 rotation in baseball? Like, we were so excited when the D-backs signed Jordan Montgomery last year. And now do we feel like we just signed Madison Bumgarner 2.0? Because when looking at Monty and his stats from this past year and trying to decide what were Monty's strengths from the 2024 season, it was a tough game to play, guys, because there were not a lot of strengths for Jordan Montgomery at all this year. And if I had to pick one out, he was actually not too bad against left-handed batters. Against righties, he was bad, and he was really bad against a lot of stuff, which we'll talk about. But against left-handed batters, actually held his own. 260 average allowed, a 390 slugging allowed, good enough for a 731 OPS. Actually decent against left-handed hitting, which might be surprising. Yes, Monty's a lefty, but when you look at the numbers that we're going to get into this segment, and all you guys watch Jordan Montgomery this past season, you guys have looked at the box scores. You guys know how bad Jordan Montgomery was in 2024 for the D-backs. So the fact that he was actually solid against a whole grouping of batters is impressive within itself. And so lefties, that's something to build off of going to next year. Maybe we turn Monty back into a reliever if he sucks again and just use him as a lefty specialist right behind a Joe Mantiply and behind I guess behind Joe Mantiply would be my guess. Also for Jordan Montgomery, when looking at his strengths from 2024, his curveball, decently effective as well. You go through the other pitches, not so much, but his curveball, again, decently effective. 270 average allowed and a 453 slugging allowed. But by the numbers, it should have been a little bit better. Expected batting average of only 255 on his curveball. Expected slugging of only 366. He had a whiff percentage of 35% as well on his curveball. So that was his most effective pitch this year. It was not that low velo fastball. It was not the changeup that hung at times. The curveball actually, surprisingly, did do some work for Jordan Montgomery this past year. Was it the best curveball in Major League Baseball? Was it even a good curveball in Major League Baseball? I don't know if I would say either of those two things, but it was actually quietly effective and got him through a lot of starts this past year. But going to next year, Jordan Montgomery is going to need to work on the rest of his pitches and get back to the guy that we saw previously in like the last 3 years prior to 2024, because Monty was a really good guy. And when you look at his numbers last year, like his curveball last year was also his most effective pitch, and it's been his most effective pitch like the last 3 years of his career. But last year, a 191 average on his curveball. Year before in 2022, a 154 average on his curveball. So a 270 average is not good. You look at his numbers the last 3 years, and it's like his batting average on his fastball is like around 250 the last couple years. This past year, it was 370. You look at the changeup, it was 321 this past year. The last couple years, it was like 240. And so all his pitches this past year, way less effective. They were all crushed, and he was just never good for the D-backs this season. And you could not understate that at all. And against right-handed batters, the numbers I think are actually kind of better than what you might expect. Like a 322 average and an 891 OPS, actually not as high as I think it would be. I felt like right-handed batters had like a 1200 OPS against Jordan Montgomery. So the fact that it was actually sub 900, quietly, I guess, kind of impressive by Jordan Montgomery, but absolutely terrible runners in scoring position. Like that was one of the most frustrating things, because he would put runners on. He did not have great command this season. And then we put runners on, such weak stuff, so much hard contact against Jordan Montgomery. 331 average allowed, 933 OPS allowed with runners in scoring position. Bad in high leverage moments. Like there was not any kind of situation that you could point to this past season where you could say, you know what? At least Jordan Montgomery was effective there. At least Jordan Montgomery came through in those situations, like early in games, late in games, second time through the order, third time through the lineup, like 6 days of rest, 100 days of rest. Like it does not matter. Like the only things he was kind of decent at this past year was going against left-handed batters and that curveball, because everything else from Jordan Montgomery's 2024 season, you just have to throw it away. And that's what we want him to do this offseason. Going to next year, throw away 2024. There's nothing to look at from 2024 that you can build off of. Nothing you could point to that you could say, hey, that was at least a positive development for me. Everything from this past year for Jordan Montgomery, toss it out. It was a bad season, but I don't want this season. I don't believe this season is indicative of the kind of future Jordan Montgomery can still have in Major League Baseball. I don't think he's as bad as what we saw in 2024. I don't think he's at the Madison Bumgarner level yet. But if he does not get in better shape this offseason, if he does not have a full offseason training program with the D-backs and does not come into camp healthy, better in shape, looking ready to dominate, he needs to come into camp hungry. And if he can do that, I believe Jordan Montgomery can have a bounce back season for the Arizona Diamondbacks. Now, that's it for this edition of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. Come back to not tomorrow, but next week for more Diamondbacks news coverage and insight. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy. Deuces.